Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, stranger corner of history. So if you're listening in bed, with the lights low and the blankets pulled close, you can let your mind wander with me as we step softly into the world of harems. Not the fantasy painted by 19th century artists with suspiciously polished marble floors, nor the scandalous exaggerations whispered by Europeans who never got past the palace gates, but the reality of daily life inside these private, forbidden quarters. The word itself comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred, and that's exactly what these spaces were meant to be. A secluded household world stretching from the Abbasid Caliphate to the Ottoman Empire, where women lived their lives behind latticed screens and locked doors, sometimes in opulence, sometimes in monotony, and often in both at once. Not all of them were concubines or mysterious beauties, but wives, daughters, widows, sisters, enslaved women, and aging aunts, all folded together into a community that was both sanctuary and prison, a place of embroidery, music, quiet prayers, gossip, and the slow shuffle of slippers across polished tiles, punctuated by the trickle of fountains and the occasional whisper of political maneuvering. Because harems, especially the grand Ottoman versions, weren't just private quarters, but political machines with their own hierarchy. At the top, the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, who wielded real influence, while below her, concubines and attendants quietly envied one another's status, all of them living lives tied to power, yet marked by isolation. Decades spent within the same walls, the outside world glimpsed only through stories or a lattice window, which made gossip both a pastime and a weapon. Rivalry simmered beneath the rose water and lamp smoke as wives vied with concubines, concubines with one another, and children became pawns in dynastic games. So that life inside was monotonous on the surface, deeply political underneath, and always shaped by the strange irony of being both cherished and caged. A system that didn't appear overnight, but grew from traditions of seclusion, family honor, and, inevitably, the tendency of powerful men to complicate matters by hoarding women as symbols of their status. When we drift further back into the early centuries of Islam, the harem wasn't yet the grand marble palace within a palace that we imagine from Ottoman Istanbul, but it was already beginning to form as a household tradition, a space reserved for wives and female relatives. And as Islam spread, so too did the idea of keeping women secluded in protected quarters, something that blended religious interpretation with older Persian and Byzantine customs of separating women's spaces. By the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th and 9th centuries, the harem had become far more elaborate, a world of silken curtains, guarded corridors, and, in Baghdad especially, filled with women brought from distant corners of the empire, enslaved Turks, Greeks, Persians, Berbers, whose beauty or talents marked them out as suitable additions to the caliph's household. Though, of course, the reality of their lives was rarely as romantic as poets like to suggest. Their days were slow, often spent learning songs, practicing instruments, or perfecting poetry, because entertainment was one of their chief duties, and at night they might be summoned, or, far more often, not summoned by the caliph, since harems were less about constant intimacy and more about potential, a symbol of power measured in how many women you could seclude behind walls. Naturally, the men in charge made it all more complicated by introducing layers of hierarchy, so that women weren't just in the harem, they were ranked, titled, and sorted, with the favored concubine known as Walad if she bore a son, immediately increasing her status in the pecking order, while those without children remained precariously perched, their futures depending on the caliph's fleeting attention. Yet within this strange domestic bureaucracy, women found ways to carve out influence, especially when a son was involved, since mothers of princes often became informal advisors, whispering suggestions into the ears of their children who, with luck and political murder on their side, might one day inherit power. Life was still monotonous: embroidered cloth, whispered prayers, the faint scent of musk and smoke, but political intrigue buzzed beneath the surface, for the Abbasid court was notorious for assassinations, poisonings, and sudden downfalls, and the harem was not untouched by such turbulence, with women sometimes playing decisive roles in who lived, who died, and who conveniently disappeared, all while their official task was supposedly just to provide company and heirs. So when we think of harems in this period, it's worth remembering that they were both gilded and grim, filled with jewels, poems, and perfumes, but also with isolation, jealousy, and the knowledge that survival depended less on beauty than on luck, cunning, and the unpredictable moods of the man at the very top. By the time we drift into the Ottoman world, the harem had grown into something vast and unmistakably political, a palace within the palace that sprawled through corridors and courtyards inside Istanbul's Topkapi, guarded by eunuchs in tall white turbans who were the only men allowed inside, since their presence was seen as safe, or at least safe enough to trust with hundreds of secluded women. Here, the structure was rigid, like a miniature empire in itself, and at the top stood the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who could wield astonishing power over both the harem and the state, sometimes overshadowing the Sultan himself, because after all, who else had raised him, whispered in his ear, and survived long enough to see him on the throne? Below her, favored concubines lived lives of careful luxury, surrounded by silks, jewels, and embroidered cushions, yet always watching their rivals with suspicion, since a single son could shift the entire balance of power. While at the bottom, ordinary servants scrubbed the tiles, tended the lamps, and carried trays of sweet sherbets without much notice. It was a place where boredom and beauty mixed in equal measure, women spending endless hours with sewing, storytelling, or music, while the more ambitious learned how to play the subtler game of politics, since entry into the Sultan's bed did not guarantee security. Only producing a child, especially a son, might do that. And even then, survival was never certain, because Ottoman succession was notorious for fratricide, which meant a mother's proudest triumph could also be her deepest fear, as one prince's rise often meant another prince's death. The harem was also a cultural engine, filled with women from across the empire, Circassians, Greeks, Slavs, Persians, Albanians, brought in through conquest or purchase, which meant languages and customs mixed behind the walls, producing a microcosm of the empire itself, though of course one heavily perfumed and carefully hidden. Outsiders, especially European visitors, often imagined orgies of decadence, but in truth, most days were quieter, slower, shaped by rituals, religious observance, and the small dramas of jealousy and gossip, while behind the latticed screens, women occasionally influenced decisions of state, with some Valid Sultan effectively running the empire during weak reigns, guiding ministers and shaping wars from behind a veil. So when we picture the Ottoman harem, we should imagine less the fantasy paintings of lounging odalisques and more a strange mixture of luxury and monotony, ambition and fear, where women could rise to immense influence or fade into forgotten corners, their lives defined not just by beauty, but by endurance, within a system designed to keep them both powerful and powerless at the same time.
As the Ottoman harem reached its political peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, it entered what historians like to call the Sultanate of Women, which is a polite way of saying that the palace's most powerful figures were not always the men sitting on the throne, but the women sitting behind latticed windows, especially the Valid sultans and favored consorts who managed to outlast the rest. And this era gave us figures like Harems Sultan, better known in the West as Roxolana, a woman of uncertain origins, possibly Ukrainian, possibly Polish, captured and sold into slavery before she ascended all the way to being the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, which was remarkable in itself since sultans traditionally did not bother with marriage, preferring to keep relationships flexible. But Suleiman broke precedent because of course he did, and her influence became so significant that European ambassadors complained about having to negotiate with a woman who technically wasn't supposed to exist in the public sphere at all. Later Valid sultans, like Kosum Sultan, wielded similar power, acting as regents for underage sons, arranging alliances, and sometimes orchestrating discreet assassinations, because naturally, if one is locked behind palace walls, one must find some way to keep things interesting. Their ability to influence imperial politics was not limited to whispers either. Entire policies, military appointments, and even foreign treaties bore the fingerprints of women whose official role was merely to produce heirs and embroider cushions, which is quite the ironic contrast. Yet despite this grand level of involvement, daily life inside the harem remained a peculiar blend of dull routine and sudden intrigue, with women spending endless hours perfecting their needlework, tending to gardens and tiled courtyards, or listening to musicians, while always keeping one ear open for signs of shifting favor, because the politics of intimacy were unpredictable and could change with a cough from the sultan, a rival's pregnancy, or the untimely death of a child. So while the empire outside fought wars across 3 continents, inside the palace, the real battles were fought with glances, alliances, and occasionally poison. And for nearly a century, this hidden world shaped the Ottoman state more than the battlefield ever could, a reminder that harems were not just private households, but shadow governments, running the empire from behind screens scented faintly of rosewater and smoke. If we step back from the thrones and daggers of the Sultanate of Women, the ordinary days inside the harem were far less dramatic, though perhaps not less strange, shaped by long stretches of quiet routine punctuated by small rituals, so that life often felt like a mixture of boarding school, monastery, and gilded cage. Mornings began slowly, with women rising to the sound of servants moving through corridors, oil lamps being snuffed out, and trays of warm water brought for washing, followed by prayers, since religion was woven tightly into the rhythm of the day. And then came lessons for the younger girls, because harems doubled as training grounds, where enslaved concubines might be taught not just the arts of pleasing the sultan, but music, poetry, calligraphy, embroidery, and even languages, since many women were brought in from distant lands and had to learn Ottoman Turkish to survive. Food was both plentiful and monotonous. Endless trays of rice, bread, fruit, sherbets, and stewed meats carried up from the palace kitchens, though always flavored with the faint awareness that meals were less about indulgence than about passing time. Afternoons might drift into embroidery circles, recitations of poetry, or music lessons, the sound of lutes and flutes echoing against tiled walls, while gossip slipped quietly from mouth to mouth, because in a place where mobility was restricted and futures uncertain, stories about who had the sultan's favor, who had fallen out of it, and who might be pregnant were both entertainment and survival strategy. Clothing was elaborate but not always comfortable, with layers of embroidered silk and gauze, hair oiled and perfumed, and trinkets of jewelry signaling rank more clearly than words ever could, so that simply walking through a courtyard was a display of hierarchy. For most women, the highlight of a week might be the chance to bathe in the harem's hammam, a steamy, echoing chamber where laughter mingled with the splash of water, and for a brief moment the rigid structure loosened and life felt almost ordinary. Evenings settled into the same quiet patterns of conversation, storytelling, perhaps a reading of the Quran, or waiting, endlessly waiting, for the chance that a eunuch might arrive with the news that the sultan had summoned someone, which meant both opportunity and danger, because entering his chambers could secure a lifetime of favor or a lifetime of rivals, depending on what followed. And through it all, the sense of enclosure pressed down gently but constantly. years passing in tiled corridors scented with rosewater, where some women dreamed of rising to influence, while others simply learned to drift with the monotony. Their lives a reminder that even within walls of gold, the days could be long, slow, and strangely hollow. If the marble walls and jeweled lamps of the harem dazzled the eyes, they also quietly pressed down on the mind, for the greatest weight carried by women inside was not the silk of their gowns or the gold of their bangles, but the slow, unchanging repetition of days, the monotony that blurred years together until time itself felt like a padded corridor without doors. Isolation was at once protective and suffocating, for many women entered the harem as girls, their memories of freedom fading with each passing season. And while some adapted, learning to savor embroidery circles, music lessons, and gossip as if they were grand adventures, others drifted into melancholy, a condition so common that poetry composed within harems often speaks in soft tones of longing, gardens unseen, rivers never visited, and the ache of hearing city sounds just beyond the lattice screen. Envy was another companion, quiet but ever present, as each woman measured herself against the shifting scale of beauty, favor, and fertility, knowing that a single pregnancy could lift one woman to prominence, while even another in permanent obscurity. And so even friendships were delicate things, laced with suspicion and resignation, because everyone was both a companion and a rival. And then, of course, there was the waiting, the endless waiting, perhaps the most defining feature of harem life, as women waited for summonses that might never come, for news from the outer world that rarely arrived, for their sons to grow old enough to matter, or for the years to pass until they themselves faded into the quiet anonymity of palace archives, remembered only in stipends and lists of household expenses. Yet it would be unfair to imagine this as constant misery, for within the stillness, many women built inner worlds, filling their minds with stories, prayers, and creativity, and the harem produced not only rivals, but poets, calligraphers, and women of wit who left traces in letters and gifts, suggesting that the psychological landscape of the harem was less a single mood than a shifting sea, with boredom lapping at the edges, envy bubbling underneath, hope glimmering faintly, and resignation always floating just on the surface, so that life inside was as much an inner struggle as it was an outer confinement, a long meditation on patience, power, and the peculiar art of enduring without moving.
While women inside the harem lived lives of routine, patience, and quiet intrigue, the outside world, especially Europe, was busily imagining something entirely different. For to European travelers and artists, the harem became less a household and more a projection of their own desires and anxieties, painted in lurid colors with suspiciously well-scrubbed women draped on suspiciously comfortable cushions, a vision that owed more to fantasy than fact. Most Europeans were never allowed anywhere near the harem. Ambassadors might be received in audience chambers, traders might glimpse outer courtyards, but the inner women's quarters were firmly closed, so instead they filled the silence with stories, some claiming that harems were vast dens of idleness and sensuality, others insisting they were prisons of unimaginable cruelty, and in either case they were nearly always wrong. Painters of the 18th and 19th centuries especially enjoyed depicting harems as scenes of perpetual lounging, with women half asleep, half naked, and curiously uninterested in the realities of embroidery or gossip, which were far more likely occupations. And the result was what we now call Orientalism, an entire cultural fantasy that made harems into symbols of Eastern decadence while conveniently ignoring that European courts had their own versions of seclusion, intrigue, and dynastic chaos. Travel writers, too, could not resist embellishment, spinning tales of jealous rivalries that erupted into murders, of sultans drowning concubines in sacks and tossing them into the Bosporus, of orgies that went on for days, stories that were far more entertaining to print back in Paris or London than the dull reality of embroidery circles and sherbet drinking. The irony, of course, is that these fantasies have often outlived the truth, so that even today the word harem conjures visions of exotic decadence instead of the long monotony of daily prayers, child-rearing, and sewing. And in this way, the harem has remained both invisible and distorted, hidden by its walls and then reimagined through someone else's gaze. A curious reminder that history is often less about what happened and more about what people wished had happened, particularly when they were painting for gallery walls rather than documenting daily life.
While the women of the harem navigated their routines, ambitions, and quiet rivalries, children were growing up in the same enclosed world, their lives shaped by the same walls, the same rituals, and the same strange mixture of privilege and restriction. For sons of sultans or princes were raised with the knowledge that their survival and future power depended on a combination of careful instruction, luck, and the sometimes unpredictable whims of their mothers and the Valid Sultan. While daughters, though often more sheltered, were similarly educated in languages, etiquette, music, and embroidery, taught both to delight in beauty and to understand the subtle currents of influence that ran through every corridor. Boys were given tutors in history, religion, and military strategy, their play often doubling as early lessons in leadership, while girls learned the art of patience, observation, and diplomacy, knowing that marriage could either elevate them to power or consign them to obscurity. And in both cases, the harem was the constant backdrop, shaping their perceptions of the world and the narrowness of choice. Yet childhood in the harem was not all study and plodding, for there were moments of genuine play, laughter echoing through the tiled halls, small gardens where they could run under watchful eyes, and lessons punctuated by games, music, and storytelling, a delicate attempt to create childhood within the boundaries of palace life, which often felt as much like a monastery as a royal household. The psychological impact, however, was profound, as isolation and constant observation taught children to measure every word, every glance, and every gesture, producing adults who could navigate intrigue as easily as a game of chess, yet who might carry a subtle melancholy for the freedoms they never experienced, a quiet longing for the city streets, markets, or gardens beyond the walls, and a complex relationship with both power and confinement, so that growing up inside the harem was a peculiar blend of education, protection, and restriction, producing heirs and daughters who were at once competent, cautious, ambitious, and quietly shaped by decades of observation and seclusion, a reminder that even in a gilded cage, childhood left its mark and prepared the next generation to continue the delicate balance of luxury, secrecy, and influence that defined the harem.
As the centuries passed, the harem, once a central institution of power, intrigue, and ritual, began to change and slowly decline, a process influenced by shifting politics, modernization, and the increasing intrusion of European ideas and technologies. For by the 18th and 19th centuries, Ottoman sultans were spending more time abroad or in public matters. Travel and communication had altered the pace of court life, and the rigid walls that had once contained generations of women and children began to feel both smaller and less relevant in a world moving toward constitutional reform and bureaucratic efficiency. The Valide sultans and powerful concubines still exercised influence, but their authority gradually eroded as European diplomats, journalists, and photographers brought tales and sometimes images of the harem to the public eye, transforming what had once been a private, sacred space into a subject of curiosity and speculation. While internally, the harem's population dwindled as fewer concubines were brought in, marriage patterns shifted, and the empire itself struggled with political and financial crises that left less room for lavish domestic ritual. By the late 19th century, Ottoman reformers began to abolish many of the traditional structures, reducing the harem to a much smaller household, confining the remaining women to ordinary family life rather than a distinct political sphere, and after the fall of the empire in the early 20th century, the harem as an institution effectively ceased to exist.
its women dispersed, its gates permanently closed, and its secrets slowly absorbed into history, folklore, and the persistent, often exaggerated European imagination. Yet even in decline, the legacy of the harem remained in subtle ways, through the descendants of sultans, through surviving letters, poetry, and architecture, and in the quiet memory of what it meant to live behind walls that were at once protective, confining, luxurious, and isolating. A world where women had exercised power in whispers, endurance in patience, and influence in gestures that history may never fully measure, leaving behind a place that was at once real and imagined, gilded and oppressive, a symbol of a vanished era that continues to fascinate because of the contradictions it embodies: secrecy and display, power and confinement, opulence and monotony.
Among the countless women who lived within the walls of harems, a few left marks so vivid that their stories survive, sometimes whispered in letters, sometimes recorded in the memoirs of visitors, and sometimes preserved in poetry, though even then filtered through layers of rumor and imagination. For example, Hurrem Sultan, the woman who rose from slavery to become the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, whose influence was not merely ceremonial but political, as she interceded in state matters, arranged marriages, and even managed correspondence with foreign leaders, all while navigating a household full of rival concubines, jealous servants, and ambitious attendants. And yet her daily life, beyond the occasional audience with the Sultan, was likely filled with embroidery, conversation, and the constant awareness that her favor could wane with a single misstep or a rival's son. Qasem Sultan, another Valid, offers an even more striking example, ruling as regent for her sons and later her grandson, orchestrating the administration of the empire from behind the screens while maintaining strict control over the harem's hierarchy, making alliances and occasionally using threats, gifts, or strategic marriages to secure her position. And though history remembers her for power, her everyday life was still shaped by waiting, watching, and managing long corridors of women who were at once her allies and potential threats, all while preserving her own status in a system where influence and danger were inseparable. Then there were women less famous, but equally remarkable, such as the poets, musicians, and calligraphers, whose works survive in small manuscripts or court records. Women who took the long hours of embroidery, music, or study and transformed them into lasting creativity, asserting a quiet form of independence in a world designed to limit it. And through all these lives, one sees the same patterns: ambition tempered by caution, influence exercised in whispers, survival balanced on the narrow edge between favor and obscurity, and an inner world shaped by decades of enclosure, observation, and careful adaptation, so that the harem, while often imagined as decadent or idle, was in practice a place of subtle power, personal resilience, and remarkable human ingenuity, a complex ecosystem where every glance, gesture, and word could shift one's position, and where women learned over years or even decades how to endure, how to manipulate, and how to leave behind traces of themselves in a world that otherwise rendered them invisible.
Beyond the famous Valide sultans, the harem was filled with countless women whose lives were shaped by rivalry, small triumphs, and quiet endurance. For instance, lesser concubines who maneuvered to gain the sultan's attention through subtle displays of skill or beauty, arranging their days around music lessons, poetry readings, or perfectly folded cushions, always aware that a single glance or word from a favored rival could alter their fortunes. Or mothers of children who whispered constantly to influence the future, cultivating alliances with attendants or other mothers, ensuring that their sons might have a chance at succession while others faded into obscurity. And even older women, once the beauty and allure had passed, played crucial roles as mediators, advisors, or enforcers of the household rules. their authority often unnoticed by outsiders but deeply felt within the corridors. The rivalries were rarely explosive. Most disputes took the form of silent competition, passive-aggressive gestures, or careful manipulation of servants and eunuchs. Yet they could be lethal in effect, determining which women rose in rank, which were assigned more luxurious chambers, and which found their influence diminished, sometimes permanently. And there were stories of women who cleverly protected themselves through strategy rather than charm, establishing networks of allies, supporting each other quietly, and occasionally outlasting those with greater beauty but less foresight, reminding us that survival inside the harem depended as much on intelligence, patience, and observation as on any outward gifts. In this sense, every day was a lesson in psychology, timing, and subtle persuasion, and though the walls of the harem were restrictive, they also created a contained world in which women could wield considerable, if hidden, power, shaping marriages, succession, and even aspects of governance from behind screens, demonstrating that influence in a palace could be exercised in whispers, gestures, or a well-timed smile, and that the seemingly monotonous rhythms of daily life, embroidery, meals, prayers, music, and gossip, were far more than idle pastimes, serving instead as the canvas on which generations of women quietly inscribed their stories, ambitions, and strategies, leaving a legacy that, though invisible to the outside world, profoundly affected the history and functioning of one of the most powerful empires in the world.
And so, as we linger in the memory of these walls, it is worth imagining the sensory world of the harem, the faint echo of footsteps on marble, the occasional clink of trays carried by servants, the soft murmur of conversations filtered through latticed screens, the rustle of silk garments, and the quiet laughter of children playing under careful supervision, all punctuated by moments of intense focus on embroidery, music, poetry, and prayer, a rhythm that was at once mundane and profoundly structured, teaching lessons in patience, observation, and endurance. One can almost feel the weight of decades passing in this enclosed world where ambition and survival intertwined, where women learned to read glances as carefully as any letter, where influence was measured in subtle gestures, whispered advice, and the careful cultivation of relationships that could shift with a single pregnancy or the death of a child, and where the quiet monotony of daily routine became a scaffold upon which the remarkable ingenuity of the harem's inhabitants was displayed. It is easy to romanticize these lives, imagining only silk and jewels, but the truth is far more human, a mixture of resilience, ingenuity, boredom, anxiety, and occasional triumphs, showing that even in confinement, creativity and influence could flourish, and that these women, through careful observation, strategy, and patience, shaped not only their own fates, but sometimes the course of empires, reminding us that power often moves in invisible currents, that history is made in whispers as much as in proclamations, and that the quiet endurance of those who live behind closed doors can leave a lasting imprint, subtle but real, on the world outside, an echo of lives spent navigating beauty, ambition, and confinement with a grace born of necessity, a reminder that history is not always in battles or laws, but in the steady persistence of human beings making their way in complex, demanding worlds.
As we settle finally into the quiet after wandering through centuries of harems, let us imagine the soft, lingering stillness of these spaces, the scented air of rosewater, the faint flicker of oil lamps casting gentle shadows on tiled walls, the muffled laughter of children long grown, the quiet footsteps of eunuchs carrying messages from one corridor to another, and the enduring presence of women who lived, waited, observed, and influenced from behind screens that both protected and confined them. And in this imagined stillness, we can reflect on the strange dualities of their world: luxury and monotony, power and invisibility, rivalry and camaraderie, education and isolation, all coexisting in a place that was both home and prison, where daily life unfolded with a rhythm as steady and measured as a heartbeat, and where the small, persistent acts of patience, strategy, and resilience shaped lives in ways that echoed far beyond the palace walls. So as you listen now, perhaps tucked under blankets, eyes growing heavy, it is comforting to remember that history is often found not only in battles and proclamations, but in quiet endurance, in whispered advice, in the subtle navigation of impossible circumstances, and in the way ordinary moments, repeated over years and decades, create lives that are at once invisible and profoundly consequential. And as the light fades outside your window and the mind drifts toward sleep, imagine the soft shuffle of slippers, the murmur of prayers, the glint of silk in faint candlelight, and the enduring spirit of those who lived behind screens, shaping their worlds quietly, persistently, and with remarkable grace, so that even in the silence and stillness their stories remain, waiting for ears patient enough to hear, hearts open enough to imagine, and minds willing to drift slowly, gently, into the quiet depth of history itself. Even after the walls of harems fell silent and the centuries moved on, their echoes linger in architecture, manuscripts, poetry, and the subtle ways women shaped history from behind screens, reminding us that influence is not always loud or public, and that power can exist in quiet gestures, patient observation, and careful strategy. And as we imagine those long corridors one last time, the scent of rosewater lingering faintly, the soft shuffle of slippers, the rustle of silk gowns, and the distant murmur of conversation, we can reflect on how these women navigated a paradoxical world of restriction and privilege, how they cultivated minds, hearts, and alliances with patience and intelligence, how they lived ordinary and extraordinary lives simultaneously, and how, even in enforced stillness, they left traces that history still recognizes if we pause to look closely. And in this moment, with night deepening outside your window and your mind ready to drift, it is perhaps comforting to think that their quiet resilience, ingenuity, and endurance remain with us in memory, a gentle reminder that human experience, even behind locked doors, is never entirely contained, that patience and observation can be forms of power, and that history's most enduring stories often whisper rather than shout, inviting us to lean back, close our eyes, and drift slowly, gently into sleep alongside centuries of lives quietly lived, deeply felt, and quietly remembered.